The cold steel of a meat hook brushed against Elena's ear as she curled into a ball behind a stack of flour sacks. In the kitchen beyond the pantry's slatted door, the air smelled of scorched garlic and copper. Wet, heavy thuds echoed against the tile, the sound of something soft hitting something hard over and over. "Where is she, Marco?" a voice rasped, smooth as silk and sharp as a razor. It was Dante Moretti, the man whose name was whispered in the back of confessionals and blood-stained counting rooms. A final, gurgling plea cut off into a sickening crunch. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The floorboards groaned as they approached her hiding spot. Elena pressed her palms over her mouth, her breath hitching in her throat as a shadow stretched under the door, blocking out the light. 10 minutes ago, Elena was just the girl who made the best osso buco in the North End, a ghost in the kitchen of a restaurant that laundered more than just napkins. Now, she was the only witness to a hit performed by the king of the city. She had two options: die in the dark among the dry pasta, or step into a world where mercy was a foreign language. The promise of a quiet life was gone, replaced by the jagged reality of survival. To understand how a girl with flour on her apron ended up with blood on her hands, you have to see the moment the pantry door creaked open. Dante Moretti didn't rip the door open. He nudged it with the toe of a handcrafted Italian leather shoe. The light hit Elena's eyes, blinding her for a heartbeat. She huddled deeper into the corner, her fingers digging into the burlap sacks until her nails bled. Dante stood there, his charcoal suit pristine despite the carnage behind him. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for a silver cigarette case. "The sauce is burning," he said, his voice devoid of the rage she expected. He tilted his head, his dark eyes tracing the line of her trembling jaw. "A waste of good veal. Stand up." Elena's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to rise. She stepped over the fallen bags, her gaze fixed on the floor to avoid the sight of Marco's body slumped over the butcher block. Dante exhaled a cloud of smoke that swirled around her like a cage. "You're the one who makes the gravy," he noted, stepping back to let her out into the heat of the kitchen. The one Marco said was invisible. He grabbed her wrist, his grip a band of fire. "You saw me." It wasn't a question. He pulled her closer until she could smell the expensive cologne and the metallic tang of death on him. "I don't leave witnesses. But I do get hungry." He shoved her toward the stove. The flames licked the bottom of a copper pot, the red sauce inside bubbling like a miniature volcano. "Fix it," Dante commanded, leaning against the counter and watching her with the intensity of a hawk. "If it tastes like fear, I'll kill you before the first bite hits my tongue." Elena's hands shook as she reached for a wooden spoon. She stirred the sauce, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She needed a way out, a weapon, a distraction. As she reached for the salt cellar, her fingers brushed against a paring knife hidden under a damp towel. She gripped the handle, her knuckles white. Dante stepped forward, his shadow falling over the pot. He reached out, not for her but for a piece of crusty bread. He dipped it into the sauce and lifted it to his lips. Elena held her breath, the knife hidden in the folds of her apron. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. A minute passed in agonizing silence. Finally he swallowed. "Too much salt," he whispered, leaning down so his lips were inches from her ear. "Just like your tears." He reached out and snatched the knife from her hand before she could even think to swing. He held the blade to her throat, the tip drawing a single drop of red. "Try that again, and I'll make sure you never cook for anyone but the devil." The back door of the kitchen burst open, and 3 men in black overcoats rushed in, their silenced pistols raised. "Boss, the Grimaldis are 2 blocks out," one of them barked. Dante didn't flinch. He kept the knife pressed against Elena's pulse. "Pack your knives," he told her, his voice a low vibration she felt in her teeth. "You're coming with me. From now on you only cook for the Moretti family. Or you rot here with Marco." Dante grabbed her by the arm and dragged her toward the waiting black SUV, leaving the scorched sauce to burn into a black crust. The leather seats of the SUV smelled of new money and old secrets. Elena sat pressed against the door, her eyes darting between the 3 armed men and the man who had just spared her life for a bowl of pasta. They sped through the rain-slicked streets of the city, the neon signs of the North End blurring into streaks of red and blue. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of a lighter as Dante flicked it open and shut. Elena looked at her hands. They were still stained with flour, a stark contrast to the dark, violent world she had been thrust into. She wasn't just a cook anymore. She was a trophy. The car pulled into a long, winding driveway lined with towering cypress trees that looked like jagged teeth against the moonless sky. The Moretti estate was a sprawling fortress of stone and iron, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning gray Atlantic. As the gates hummed shut behind them, Elena realized the pantry had been a safer cage. Dante pushed her out of the car and toward a set of heavy oak doors. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of floor wax and lilies. "Take her to the kitchen," Dante ordered a hulking man named Rocco. "See that she has everything she needs. And Rocco, if she tries to leave, break her legs. She doesn't need them to stir a pot." Rocco led her down a labyrinth of hallways, his footsteps heavy as a funeral march. The kitchen at the Moretti estate was a cathedral of stainless steel and industrial appliances, cold and clinical. "You work from 5 in the morning until the boss goes to bed," Rocco grunted, pointing to a small windowless room off the main pantry. "That's where you sleep. Don't touch the wine and don't talk to the help." He slammed the door behind him, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoing in the hollow space of her chest. Elena sat on the edge of the narrow cot, her fingers tracing the cold metal of the bed frame. If you believe that a person's talent should be their ticket to freedom, not their prison sentence, hit the like button so Elena's story reaches those who value the art of survival. Hours bled into a restless sleep. She woke to the sound of a bell ringing sharply. 5 a.m. Elena stood in the vast kitchen, the silence pressing against her ears. She began to prep, her movements mechanical, a dance she had performed 1,000 times in the warmth of her aunt's trattoria. But here, every chop of the knife felt like a countdown. She prepared an omelette for Dante, fontina cheese, fresh herbs and a hint of truffle oil. Her hands didn't shake this time. She was past fear, she was into the cold, hard logic of the trapped. She was plating the eggs when Dante walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a white silk shirt, unbuttoned at the top, and his hair was damp. He looked less like a monster and more like a man, which made him infinitely more dangerous. He sat at the prep table and gestured for her to serve him. Elena set the plate down, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the eggs. He took a bite, his expression unreadable. "My mother used to make this," he said softly, staring at a spot on the wall behind her. "She died when I was 6. I haven't tasted it correctly since." He looked at her then, his gaze heavy with a strange, dark nostalgia. "What's your name?" Elena swallowed hard. "Elena," she whispered. Dante nodded as if committing the sound to memory. "Elena, you have a gift. People kill for gifts like this. They also die for them." He pushed the plate away, barely half-eaten. "Tonight the commission meets here. 12 men who control everything from the docks to the State House. If the meal is perfect, I win their respect. If it fails, I lose my territory." He stood up, towering over her. "And if I lose, you lose your head. Do you understand?" Elena nodded, the weight of 12 lives and one city pressing down on her shoulders. "I need veal, porcini mushrooms and a specific vintage of Chianti," she said, her voice finally steady. Dante smirked, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "Rocco will get you whatever you need. Don't disappoint me, Elena." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "By the way, the paring knife you tried to use was dull. I had Rocco sharpen all the blades in here. Use them wisely." The door clicked shut, leaving her alone with the gleaming steel. The pressure was a physical weight, a vice tightening around Elena's temples as the sun began to set. The kitchen was a blur of steam and sizzle. She moved with a desperate grace, her mind focused on the chemistry of the food, the only thing she could control in this house of blood. She was searing the veal when she heard a voice from the shadows of the pantry. "He's going to kill them, you know." Elena spun around, a chef's knife in her hand. A woman stood there, dressed in a maid's uniform, her face pale and her eyes darting toward the hallway. "Who are you?" Elena hissed. "Sienna," the woman whispered, stepping into the light. "I've been here 3 years. I've seen 4 cooks come through this kitchen. None of them left through the front door." She leaned in close, the scent of lavender and bleach clinging to her. "The commission meeting isn't a dinner. It's a trap. Dante is going to poison them and he's going to use your food to do it. When they drop, he'll blame the girl from the North End. He gets the territory, and the police get a convenient scapegoat." Elena felt the room tilt. The paring knife, the sharpened blades, the gift, it wasn't about the food. It was about the delivery system. "How do you know?" Elena asked, her voice cracking. Sienna pulled a small glass vial from her pocket. "I was told to put this in the salt you're using for the main course. If I don't, it's my brother's life." She looked at Elena, her eyes filling with a frantic, wet light. "Help me. If we both do it, maybe he'll let us go. If we don't, we're both dead by midnight." Elena looked at the vial, then at the veal resting on the counter. The meat was perfectly browned, the mushrooms earthy and rich. To poison it was to desecrate the only thing she had left. But to refuse was to sign her own death warrant. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, Rocco coming to check on the progress. "Put it in," Sienna urged, shoving the vial into Elena's hand. "He's coming." Elena gripped the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. She looked at the door, then back at the stove. The door swung open and Rocco's massive frame filled the entrance. "Is it ready?" he grunted, his eyes scanning the room. Elena stood by the stove, her hands hidden behind her back. Sienna was already at the sink, scrubbing a pot with frantic energy. "Almost," Elena said, her voice remarkably calm. She turned to the stove and sprinkled a pinch of salt over the veal. Rocco nodded and stomped back out. Elena opened her hand. The vial was still there, the seal unbroken. She looked at Sienna, whose face went from pale to ghostly white. "You didn't do it," Sienna breathed. "I don't poison my food," Elena said, her jaw set in a hard line. She walked to the window and threw the vial out into the darkness of the Atlantic. "If Dante wants to kill them, he can do it himself." She turned back to the stove, her mind racing. She had less than 30 minutes before the meal was served. She needed a way to warn the men without Dante knowing, or a way to make Dante think the poison was working. She looked at the ingredients on the counter, the bitter herbs, the dark wine, the heavy cream. An idea began to form, a desperate culinary gambit. The dining room was a sea of velvet and mahogany. 12 men sat around the long table, their faces etched with years of hard decisions and cold violence. At the head sat Dante, a king among wolves. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the undercurrent of unspoken threats. Elena entered the room, carrying the first course, a delicate soup of roasted squash and sage. Her hands were steady, her face a mask of professional neutrality. As she served Dante, he caught her eye, a silent question in his dark gaze. She moved around the table, serving the men who held the fate of the city in their hands. As she reached the man to Dante's right, Silvio Grimaldi, the oldest and most dangerous of the group, she leaned in close. "The wine," she whispered, so low it was barely a breath. "Wait for the toast." Silvio's eyes sharpened, but he didn't move. Elena retreated to the kitchen, her skin crawling with the sensation of 13 pairs of eyes on her back. She had planted the seed. Now she had to wait for it to grow. In the kitchen, she prepared the main course with a frantic, focused energy. She used the bitterest herbs she could find, masking them with a heavy reduction of the Chianti. It wouldn't kill them, but it would make them feel the first symptoms of the poison Sienna had described: nausea, a sharp spike in heart rate, a sudden cold sweat. It was a bluff, a theatrical performance staged on a plate. She plated the veal, her fingers flying as she garnished the meat with sprigs of rosemary that looked like tiny, jagged swords. She returned to the dining room, the weight of the silver tray a physical burden. As she placed the plates before the men, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Dante raised his glass. "To the future of our families," he said, his voice ringing out like a bell. "And to the woman who made this possible." He looked at Elena, his eyes cold and expectant. The men raised their glasses and drank. Then they began to eat. Elena stood in the corner, her breath trapped in her lungs, watching as 12 forks moved in unison. If you believe that the truth is the most dangerous ingredient in any room, hit the like button so the algorithm knows the story matters. 5 minutes passed. The only sound was the clinking of silverware and the heavy breathing of the men. Then Silvio Grimaldi dropped his fork. It clattered against the china like a gunshot. He gripped the edge of the table, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Dante," he gasped, his hand flying to his throat. One by one, the other men began to slump in their chairs, their faces contorting in pain. Dante sat unmoved, his glass still halfway to his lips. He looked at the men, then at Elena, a slow, dark smile spreading across his face. "What is this, Dante?" another man hissed, clutching his stomach as he tumbled from his chair. Dante stood up, his presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating power. "The end of an era," he said softly. He turned to Elena, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked into his waistband. "You did well, Elena. Better than I expected." He leveled the gun at her chest. "But like I said, I don't leave witnesses." Elena stood her ground, her gaze fixed on his. "The poison isn't real, Dante," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence of the dying room. Dante froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. Behind him, Silvio Grimaldi sat up, his face returning to its normal color. The other men followed suit, their agony vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. They stood up, their chairs screeching against the floor, and reached into their jackets. 12 muzzles were suddenly pointed at Dante Moretti. Silvio looked at Dante, his eyes cold with a predatory satisfaction. The girl warned us, Dante. She told us to look for the bitter taste. She told us to wait. Dante's face transformed, the mask of the king shattering to reveal the desperate beast beneath. He spun around looking for a way out, but the room was a cage. Elena, he growled, his voice a low, guttural snarl. He turned back to her, the gun still in his hand, but Rocco burst through the door, his own weapon raised. Boss, the perimeter is breached. The Grimaldi's men are inside. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of shattering glass, the roar of gunfire, the frantic shouts of men fighting for their lives. Elena dove under the table as bullets chewed through the mahogany above her. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. She crawled toward the kitchen door, her mind focused on one thing: survival. She reached the hallway and ran, her heart screaming in her chest. She passed Sienna, who was huddled in a corner, her face buried in her hands. Run! Elena shouted, grabbing the woman by the arm. They raced toward the back exit, the sounds of the battle echoing through the vaulted halls of the Moretti estate. They reached the heavy oak doors leading to the cliffs. Elena shoved them open, and the cold salt air hit her like a physical blow. They scrambled down the rocky path toward the churning Atlantic, the waves crashing against the jagged stones below. Behind them, the estate was a silhouette of fire and shadows. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind a large boulder, blocking their path. It was Dante. His shirt was torn and blood flowed from a jagged cut on his forehead. He held a gun in one hand and a heavy iron key in the other. "You ruined it," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet rage. "Everything I built. All for a few scraps of food and a sense of pride." He stepped toward Elena, the gun leveled at her head. Sienna screamed and backed away, but Elena stood her ground. "You were never a king, Dante," she said, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "You were just a bully with a big house. A real king knows that the people who feed him are the ones who truly hold the power." Dante roared and raised the gun, but a shot rang out from the darkness above. He jerked back, his shoulder blooming with a red stain. He stumbled toward the edge of the cliff, his eyes wide with shock. Silvio Grimaldi stepped into the light, his rifle smoking. Dante looked at Elena one last time, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred before he slipped. He vanished into the black abyss of the Atlantic without a sound. The iron key clattered against the rocks and slid into the surf. Elena sank to her knees, the adrenaline draining from her body and leaving her hollow. Sienna collapsed beside her, sobbing with relief. Silvio walked down the path and stood over them. He didn't offer a hand. He just looked at Elena with a grim, professional respect. "The city is mine now," he said. "And the girl who saved the commission has a debt owed to her." He reached into his pocket and tossed a heavy bundle of cash at her feet. "Go back to the North End, Elena. Buy your own restaurant. And if you ever see a man in a charcoal suit, run. If you believe that courage is the secret ingredient that changes the flavor of fate, drop a like so this story reaches those who need to hear it." 3 months later. The North End was alive with the sound of bells and the smell of roasting garlic. Elena stood in the doorway of her new restaurant, the Pantry. It was small, warm, and filled with the light of a dozen candles. The sign out front didn't say, "Invisible." It said, "Elena's." She walked back to the kitchen, her hands moving with a new, confident grace. She was prepping the osso buco when the bell above the door chimed. She walked out to the front, wiping her hands on her clean white apron. A man sat at the corner table, his face hidden by a newspaper. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored. Elena's heart skipped a beat, her fingers ghosting over the scar on her wrist where Dante had gripped her. The man lowered the paper. It wasn't Dante. It was Rocco. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and set a small, silver paring knife on the table. It was perfectly sharpened. "The boss is dead," Rocco said, his voice a low rumble. "But the family remembers. We don't want a debt. We want a meal." He looked around the warm, inviting space. A real meal. Elena looked at the knife, then at the man who had once threatened to break her legs. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, hard sense of power. She picked up the knife and tucked it into her apron. "Table 4, she said, her voice ringing out in the quiet room. "I'll be out in 10 minutes. And Rocco, tell the family the sauce is on the house." She turned back to the kitchen, the steam rising around her like a protective cloak. She was no longer the girl hiding among the flour sacks. She was the woman who held the knife. As she stirred the sauce, she caught her reflection in the stainless steel. Her eyes were hard, her jaw set. She had stepped out of the pantry and into the fire, and she had come out tempered like steel. The city might belong to the wolves, but the wolves still had to eat. And Elena was the only one who knew how to feed them. The night was long, but for the first time in her life, the darkness didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a canvas. Elena plated the food, the vibrant reds of the sauce and the earthy browns of the meat a testament to her survival. She was the cook who knew the secrets of the kings, the witness who had outlived the hitman. She was Elena. And in her kitchen she was the only boss that mattered. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. The restaurant was full, the air humming with the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses. Elena watched from the kitchen door, a ghost of a smile on her lips. She had built a fortress of flavor, a sanctuary of salt and silk. The wolves would always be at the door, but now she had the keys. She turned back to the stove, the flames reflecting in her eyes, and began to cook. The steam in the kitchen became a shroud, obscuring the faces of the men in the dining room, but it couldn't drown out the sound of the front door splintering. Rocco didn't even have time to stand before the windows blew inward. Glass rained down like diamonds onto the white tablecloths, and the warm scent of slow-cooked veal was instantly replaced by the sharp, acidic bite of tear gas. I didn't hide in the pantry this time. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the range and dove behind the stainless steel prep station. Federal agents. Nobody move. The shout was followed by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of boots on the hardwood. I looked at Rocco. He was on the floor, his hands laced behind his head, the silver paring knife I'd just given him kicked into the shadows. But they weren't looking for him. A pair of tactical boots stopped right in front of my station. I looked up to see a woman in a Kevlar vest, her eyes cold as flint. She wasn't an agent. I recognized the gold signet ring on her finger, the same one Dante had worn. It was his sister, Isabella Moretti. My brother was a fool, but he was a Moretti, Isabella said, her voice a whip crack in the silent kitchen. She reached down and hauled me up by my apron, the fabric straining against my throat. You're the little bird who sang to the Grimaldis. You're the reason the Moretti name is being dragged through the mud in a dozen federal indictments. She shoved a tablet in front of my face. It was a live feed of the harbor. They weren't just searching for bodies. They were pulling up the crates Dante had hidden under the pier, crates filled with the city's stolen history. Isabella didn't want my recipes. She wanted the ledger Dante told me about that final night, the one he said was baked into the foundation. I realized then that the secret ingredient wasn't a metaphor. The ledger isn't in a bank vault, Isabella, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. It's in the restaurant. Dante made sure I was the only one who could find it. I led her to the massive old-fashioned brick oven in the corner. I reached into the soot-stained crevice behind the flue and pulled out a small soot-covered tin. Inside wasn't paper. It was a single encrypted flash drive. Isabella snatched it, her eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. With this, I don't just rebuild the family. I own every politician Dante ever bought. She turned to her men, gesturing toward me. Kill her. Burn the restaurant. Let the headlines say the gas line leaked. As she turned to leave, I saw Rocco move. He hadn't been waiting for the feds. He'd been waiting for a distraction. He lunged from the shadows, a meat hook in his hand, and the kitchen descended into a blur of motion. I didn't wait to see who won. I grabbed the bottle of high-proof grappa from the shelf, smashed it against the stove, and watched the blue flames roar to life. If you want the empire, Isabella, you have to earn it in the fire. I screamed over the roar of the blaze. The tear gas ignited, a dull whoosh sending a wave of heat that knocked everyone to the floor. I scrambled through the back exit, the cold north end air hitting my lungs like a miracle. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the water, where the ruins of the Moretti estate still loomed on the cliff. If you believe that some legacies are meant to be burned to the ground, hit the like button so the truth can finally rise from the ashes. The restaurant was a hollowed-out shell by morning, but I wasn't mourning the brick and mortar. I sat on a park bench watching the investigators sift through the charcoal. A shadow fell over me. It was Silvio Grimaldi. He looked older in the daylight, his suit less a suit of armor and more a shroud. Isabella is gone, he said, sitting beside me. She tried to flee with the drive, but the encryption had a failsafe. It didn't just lock the data, it sent it to the district attorney the moment she tried to bypass the firewall. He looked at me, a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. You didn't just destroy the Morettis, Elena. You destroyed the system. There are no more kings in this city. I looked at my hands, the calluses from the knives finally starting to fade. I didn't want to be a queen, Silvio. I just wanted to cook. I stood up and handed him a small folded piece of paper. That's the recipe for the osso buco. Make sure the new guys get it right. The city's going to be hungry. I walked away, leaving the mafia, the betrayal, and the heat of the kitchen behind. I had a new name, a clean slate, and a small bistro in a town where nobody knew what a Moretti was. As the sun set over the horizon, I realized that the pantry wasn't a cage anymore. It was a memory. And for the first time in my life, I was the one who decided what was on the menu.